brothers, do you recall when the grasslands reached to the horizon? And the deafening roar of countless wings overhead. Back when Rome was a village and Britain the Emerald Island. Before we gave up on our future and buried our dead.
So this is going to be our episode 21, and we're continuing with the, early Persia. We talked a little bit about Zoroastrianism last time, and this time I'm going to tell the fun and exciting story of how Persia happened. So we remember from a couple of podcasts ago that when the Assyrian Empire collapsed, or rather was happily collapsed by other people who really hated it, that in its place several states formed. There's Jake. That in its place, several states have formed, and that would be, of course, the New Babylon, the Neo-Babylonian Kingdom. It would be the Median Kingdom, which was formed basically by people of Persian collective. And we remember that the word Persian means basically Parsia. It's people who live beyond the edge. It's people who left the original Aryan voyage. And in its place, formed and remained a couple of the other kingdoms that were there. There was the Lydian kingdom and some of the local Semitic little tribes, and basically the majority. And let me actually pull up a map right away. And before we get too far into it, I want to go ahead and send out a shout to Marvine and his team. I'm almost exclusively using his material in this particular episode, and I just want to give credit where credit is due. Marvine is fantastic to work with. And I'm very grateful to him for letting us use his material, because I just want to say a couple of words about Marvine. I mean, he is one of those people who really enjoys sharing information that he has with other people, and he does not seek any recognition or monetary gain from it. He does it for the love of history. And I think that that's how it should be really in this world. But unfortunately, everything is copyrighted, so. Okay, here's the map. Again, I apologize, it's in Russian, right back to this to the subject of copyright. But if we look at this map, it's the same territory we've been looking at all along. And this is the New Babylonian Kingdom right here. And this is the Kingdom of Media, which is where all these nomadic people, after their ability and their help that they offered to Babylon to destroy and wreck the much hated Assyria, where most of them have settled. And guys, if you like this podcast, if you like what we're doing, just please go ahead and like. We much appreciate it. It helps us out. It helps out the channel. And if you dislike what we're doing, then just dislike it. Leave comments. I will do my best to respond. Thank you, everybody who is watching. We've got people from all over the world, which is pretty awesome. So Assyria has collapsed. In Media, there's joy. And these nomadic peoples have finally got a land of their own very plentiful comparing to where they came from, very cultured, very civilized land. In Babylon, the rejoicing that's going on is hard to describe and overrate. It's the New Babylonian Kingdom, it forms in a very upbeat, very victorious, very glorious mood. In some way, it really reminds me of the way that this, when Israel was formed after World War II, where, after so much losses, so much tragedy, so much oppression, the Jewish people were finally able to unite and build themselves a state. The Babylonians have undergone similar, what happened in Babylon, it was about 400 years, but they have lost a lot of their people, a lot of their population. So when they came back together, there was this whole Babylonian revival, all the immigrants, all the resistance fighters, all the people who have been exiled, refugees who fled, started returning to Babylon. And there was this whole mood of let's rebuild our civilization. We have overthrown the Assyrians, the oppressors, the fascists, they're gone. And now we can build our new bright world, right? But they had a little trauma, a national trauma. I mean, you got to remember that our happy, joyful, very kind of trade-oriented, very spoiled in a way Babylonians that they were before the Assyrian conquest. They have spent 400 years brutal regime fighting against oppression, fighting against repressions, trying to basically being guerrilla fighters. So they have turned into real hardened, embittered peoples. And so their national trauma was, how do we prevent this from ever happening to us again? How can we make sure that nobody ever, under any circumstances, can possibly conquer us again? And so they start to think about, what can we do to make sure that we are the strongest, the biggest? Well, the best thing that they could come up with was, unfortunately, to emulate Assyria. The way that they figured it out, since we've been conquered by these people, and since these people seem to be very successful, maybe they did something right. Now, when the Babylonian Kingdom started kind of coming back together, one of the first things they did, they elected themselves a new ruling dynasty, and that dynasty is known as the Balthazar Dynasty, and it's known by the name of the very last of its kings, actually. Balthazar Dynasty. So almost immediately after the formation of their new, beautiful, fresh state, a crisis started occurring in Babylon. And the crisis was happening because they started doing what they just overcame. They started militarizing. The rulers immediately started raising an army. They started raising taxes, very harsh Assyrian-style taxation on all the peoples of Babylon. Making sure that they had very strong military force so that they could defend themselves. They utilized all the existing Assyrian military structures and infrastructure and bureaucratic structure to all the deliveries, all the logistics, everything that the Assyrians had, except now it was done on the Babylonian in the Babylonian fashion. I mean, basically they became Assyria number two. And so they also came up with a very brilliant idea that thought to themselves, well, Assyrians were very successful. What did the Assyrians do besides having this really brutal army? Oh, wait, they had a centralized religion. And so the rulers came up with a brilliant idea. Let's do the same thing. Let's make us have a centralized religion. And they decided to pick a central deity. Now, they did not pick Marduk, which would have made perfect sense because Marduk was an old god, that was kind of venerated throughout the Babylonian lands. No, the rulers decided to pick out their own god, which was kind of a minor deity. It was really the protector, the patron deity of the dynasty. The name of the god was actually Shin or Sin, and was a minor moon deity. But they decided that this deity was now going to be the central, the dominant deity of the Babylonian kingdom. And then they did something unspeakable. Jake, that's awesome. Nice breakfast. Cheers to everyone with whatever this is. Some sort of juice. So the Assyrian rule, I'm confusing them with the Assyrians for a reason. It's because they started acting like Assyrians. They sent out their people all over the empire. And they started doing what even the Assyrians never did. They started confiscating local idols, local little gods from every village in the province, and bringing them all by force to the central city. And they started building kind of a official pantheon, and started arranging all these deities in a little pretty circle around this new deity of Shin or Sin that nobody has ever heard of before. And of course, the villagers, the various little town folks, they were outraged. I mean, here they are, they just got rid of Assyria. The Assyrians didn't even touch their idols, because these idols are not even, they don't have any gold on them. They're not precious. They may be carved out of wood or made out of rock. This is their local itty-bitty deity. And of course, a major deity like Marduk, he might appear and pop into his statues and temples once in a while, but in overall sense, Marduk doesn't live in his fetishes. To where these minor deities, I mean, those little statues, they really, sometimes not little statues, they really were their homes. If you remove the statue from the town or from the village, that means you're taking away the very protecting deity of that particular locality. And so, of course, immediately revolts followed. And these revolts were brutally suppressed by the central regime, by the new Babylonian military. And there was a sense of unrest, sense of discontent in the Babylonian lands. But one thing kept the entire country from rising up and overthrowing this new dynasty, which was acting very un-Babylonian in its own way. And that's the fact that suddenly and unexpectedly, this new Babylonian army was very successful in the battlefield. Babylon decided to undertake a very expansionist, very aggressive policy, and they started conquering the lands around them. By the way, for the worship of this new deity, of the Shin deity, it was mandatory worship for everyone. If you refused to worship these people, this god as your central god, you would be arrested and thrown basically into a work concentration camp. The old work camps that the Assyrians used to use, what also began in Babylon was kind of, again, similar to World War II, was what was happening in victorious France after the fascist occupation was overthrown, where there's almost a witch hunt for anybody who was considered to be an Assyrian collaborator. And sometimes people that were being arrested were, for example, just merchants who simply were doing trade with the Assyrians because, well, whom else do you do trade with in the Assyrian Empire? Sometimes it would be their children who themselves were resistance fighters, but nonetheless came from a family of merchants who did trade with the Assyrians. So, I mean, it suddenly became a fairly dark, oppressive, totalitarian situation, which was not very normal for Babylon at all. So they started their conquests. And they started pretty much, first of all, they managed to conquer all the nearby Semitic tribes. And then they marched against Jerusalem and Israel. And you got to give it to the Jews. As always, they fought. The Jewish people are always very fierce in fighting for their lands. And, the Jewish people put up quite a resistance against this new threat of Babylon. And it took several years for the Babylonian army to actually overcome them. But when they were finally overcome, they took the city of Jerusalem. They destroyed the temple, which for the Jewish nation is an absolute tragedy, because for the Jews, there can only be one temple and one temple only. And it can only be built in one specific locale. Once it's destroyed, you can either rebuild it right on the spot, or you just have no temple, which, for example, is the situation right now, because there is another holy site that's built on the spot where the temple of the Jewish people used to be. And so they have no temple, and the synagogues, they're places of gathering and kind of talking. They're not temples as such. So after the city was taken and sacked, after the temple was actually destroyed, I mean, the Jewish people were demoralized horribly. And that's when the famous, exile of the Jews, when the Babylonian captivity takes place, where Assyrians relocated only a certain amount of the population, only the elite. The Babylonians, they took pretty much everyone out of that land and actually did exactly what the Assyrians used to do, and that is, deportation, forcible exile, and that kind of stuff. So, and then the next brilliant idea that the Babylonian ruling kings decided to pursue, they looked around and they thought about, whom else do we have to conquer? Well, we conquered almost everybody this way, we conquered everybody that way. Aha, we have Egypt. And those, excuse my language, idiots attacked Egypt. The same Egypt that just helped them overthrow the Assyrians. And Egyptian pharaohs said, what? You're doing what to us? Excuse me? We never again will help what alliances? We do not trust in alliances anymore, you treacherous dogs. And they pretty much, they beat the army into smithereens. And so that whole conquest did not work out very well. So that's where the expansion of the Babylonian kingdom stopped. But nonetheless, the Babylonian kingdom continued to suppress any rebellions, any discontent within its own territory, and it's continued to instill this forced new religion. So remember this. And meanwhile, all the little surrounding kingdoms that still existed, let me pull up that map again and just show it to you guys. Again, here we have the Media. Media was fairly large, so they didn't touch it. But this right here is, we have Lydian kingdom, other little kingdoms around. So all the nearby little kingdoms are looking at this quite sadly and thinking, well, we just did away with the Assyrian Empire, why is it with us again? What's going on? So that's what was going on in Babylon. Babylon was pretty much, it was victorious, but it was in a very unstable, there was a lot of discontent, a lot of inner dislike of the situation that was going on, and a lot of hostility between the conquered peoples and the main, and actually even the local Babylonian peoples and the main ruling dynasty. I'm going to stop for a second, see if anybody has anything to say.
Yeah, back in the 1960s, there was an educator worked in Central and South America. His name is William Frere. And he wrote a book called Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And the main premise of the book was the main thing that the oppressed learn from their oppressors is to become oppressors themselves.
Right.
And this has been going on throughout, human history to the present day.
Absolutely. Anybody else?
Yeah, just what Fenrir said was replacing Assyrians with Assyrians 2.0.
Yeah, pretty much. Pretty much.
Yeah, I have to agree. It's a very unfortunate tendency of humans to do that. I don't even understand it myself.
Yeah. Well, and it's kind of like, oftentimes you see people who have been abused in their childhood sometimes grow up to be abusers. Sometimes they don't, but it seems to be a way that human beings have to lash out against any sort of negative experiences they may have had. Alrighty, so I'm going to move on to Media. Now, meanwhile, in Media, there's a crisis going on of its own. It's only been a couple, maybe generations since this whole defeat of the Assyrian Empire took place. And the Median kings, the Median army has not really fought anyone since they've taken this really rich land. I mean, these were, again, barbaric nomadic tribes, basically Persian tribes, but a section of these Persian tribes, they took over these very civilized, very rich, very wealthy territories with this already built-in infrastructure. They started using this infrastructure. They grew fat, they grew spoiled. First of all, they adopted the entire court etiquette of the Assyrian Empire, which was not at all normal for the Aryans, for the Persians to kind of crawl on the floor before the ruling king and so on and so forth. They adopted another thing from Assyria because, as we mentioned before, in the Aryan tribes and all these Indo-European, Indo-Iranian, Aryan, however you want to call them, there's a lot of debate on what to call each of these tribes. Bottom line is, I call them all Aryans just for the convenience sake. They're all the people who had chariots, rode on horses, came basically from the region of the Caspian Sea and the surrounding area. Not modern day Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Russia, that whole steppe region. In their tradition, there was a lot of equality, as we remember, with the Hittites between females and the males. And actually the females could also inherit if there was no male heirs. Well, what the ruling dynasty in Media did, they decided to adopt this only patrilineal form of inheritance where only the sons could inherit. Another thing that they did is they got snobbish. Because not far from them, off, a little bit actually on this map, it doesn't really show where Persia. I wish I had a better map. Sometimes the maps are hard to find. I'm going to show it roughly here. Over here is where the Persian Empire, Parsia is in this area right here. This is the maximum expanse of Media. But they started treating these other tribes, which were basically just identical tribes to them. They were no different. They all came together, to this land. The Medians started treating them as second-class citizens. They started not allowing their daughters to marry into these barbarian tribes. They started not allowing them to hold high positions in the military or any sort of administrative positions. They looked at them as you nomadic barbarians, you dirty, horse people out there. And even though they had the same religion, they were also Austrian. The priesthood of the mages, as they're known, the priests of that territory, of the Persian territory, Parsia, in the Median territory, were not allowed to basically enter temples, to conduct rituals. They had to undergo special cleansing procedures. I mean, they were just being treated as second-class citizens. So there was a break happening in this whole territory that was formerly one united conglomeration of related tribes. And at that time, in the land of Media, ruled a king by the name of Ishturak. And I'm going to pronounce all these names. I'm going to give you the Greek versions, but I'm also going to give you the actual Aryan or the Median or the. By the way, Media just means middle land. To where Parsi is, the land far off on the edge or the land beyond the edge. Media just means middle land. So the name of this king was Ishtuvak. In Greek, he's actually pronounced as Istiach. But Ishtuvak was about 40 years old when he came to the throne himself, and he had a large family. And his oldest child happened to be his daughter. Now, the daughter's name, and this is an important name because it's going to come up over and over later on in various Persian dynasties. Her name is Atosa or Atosha, which would be the Persian pronunciation of it. And Atosha was about 16 years old, very pretty, very ambitious, and very pissed off about the fact that her father and her grandfather decided to change the inheritance rules. She thought that she had every right to rule, just like her brothers did, because her brothers were younger than her. And she thought that at the very least she should get major province or some sort of territory of her own to govern. Now, she was young, she was pretty, kind of like Catherine the Great in Russia. She had some admirers in the royal guard, in the army. So she started plotting a coup because she felt just mistreated by her dad. And of course, her being 16 years old and not very brilliant at all this stuff, this came to the king's knowledge, and the coup was nipped and basically just stopped before it even had a chance to take off. Of course, all her collaborators, all her people who were helping her, all the military individuals who were part of this plot got arrested, executed, and so forth. But this was early Zoroastrism. And to kill your family member, to kill your own daughter was just not a good idea. It was not a part of their morality. And so Ishtuvak decided that he was not going to kill his daughter for plotting against him. He decided that he was going to make her swear a holy oath before the sacred flames that she was going to leave the land of Media and never, ever, ever set her foot beyond its borders again. And she swore this oath rather than be executed. And she got exiled into the wild, wild lands, where these wild Yaqui barbarians lived. Of course, that would be the lands of Parsi. Now, you got to understand, this princess, basically, she was, from the Median point of view, she was an exiled daughter of the king in disfavor, who was given horses, some servants, a couple warriors to protect her, just some basically fairly poor entourage, and sent off into the wild lands. Well, but she arrived in Parsi with all these horses, gold, carpets, servants, warriors. It was like, I don't know, the coming of the greatest, most wealthy, most amazing, shining, the most royal, beautiful thing ever to that territory. They have never seen wealth like that in Parsi. Because Parsi was still populated by various, lords and lordships, by various herders, cow herders and horse herders who lived the same kind of, down to the lands, kind of rough and basically cowboys. It was Wild West. And here comes this basically a whole caravan of exquisite, rich people with this beautiful young girl. And of course, all the lords and lordlings and the little local kings, they all immediately flocked to Atosha, offering her themselves in marriage. And so she had quite a choice. And so she chose one of the local lords who ruled one of the more, how would I put it, one of the more promising, one of the more wealthy lands in that region. His name was Hahatan Ahamanish. And of course, that's where our name of Achaemenid, the famous Persian dynasty. You know whom I'm talking about. Everybody knows what I'm referring to, right? Right. So that's where that name comes from. So Atosha decided to marry this basically shepherd king. And of course, the shepherd king, he had some of the wealthiest lands where he had plentiful herds, and he had a lot of, hungry, angry, warlike cowboys basically under his control. Now, of course, Atosha, being a very good Zoroastrian and true believer, she would not violate her oath to her father. But very shortly after their marriage, a son was born to this family. And the son, they named him Kurush, known as Cyrus in English language. In Greek, he was known as Kiras. In Russian, he's known as Kir. I'm going to call him Kurush because that was his actual proper Persian name. Kurush was being brought up by his mother, who was, after all, a royal Median princess, and by his father, who was a local, kind of very tough, very glorious warlord. And of course, from the moment that he was being brought up, this kid was told that, look, you are the heir to you're the true and absolute heir to the Median throne, because I, your mother, am the firstborn daughter. I'm the oldest one in the family. I should have, by all laws of our traditions of our people, I should have absolutely taken the throne. I was exiled unfairly, and it is your rightful place on that throne. So long behold, when the kid hits 16 years old, he says, okay, mommy. He takes his father's army and he heads for Media. And I'm going to stop here and see if anybody has anything to say.
This sounds like a theme that gets replayed in ancient history and mythology over and over again. The prodigal son returning.
Absolutely. Anyone else? All right, then I will continue. So, Al-Kurush, even though he was 16 years old, he was a clever son of a bitch. Excuse my language. He did not go and attack his former homeland. Oh no. Instead, he went on a visit to the local holy sites. In other words, he was not invading. He was not attacking. He was just a young man from the outskirts of the kingdom who wanted to visit some very local, at that time they had local, holy flames throughout the territory where somebody who was a pious Zoroastrian would want to visit throughout his lifetime and pay homage to and offer gifts to the local altars and, to the local sacred flames. And so Kurush went to visit these holy locations. It was just a rather large entourage of very armed, very warlike men. And, the first province that he came to, he happened to notice that, it seemed that the taxes were just a little high in that territory. And that didn't seem to be very right to him. That didn't seem to be the righteous Zoroastrian way. He also noticed that, the temple was in disrepair. The priests were not very well dressed. And in general, it seems like, the centralized authority just wasn't paying the proper attention to this region. So he handed out a lot of money, gave a lot of gifts to the temple, to the priests. He hung a few tax collectors from the central region, liberated the local serfs and gave them more land, and then went on to the next nearest sacred site with his very large righteous entourage of very armed men who, in their righteous outrage at these indecencies going on, once again, made sure that the priests were taken care of, repaired the temple, freed some serfs. David, are you talking to me? Are you trying to jump? Okay. Bottom line is, and so this went on for a while. This young man from the outskirts of the empire is just going on a little pious trip around, the kingdom, and he's here and there just basically everywhere he goes, the priesthood switches to his side. The local people love him. He leaves gifts behind because he brings not only his mother's leftover wealth, but also his father's accumulated wealth, and gives great gifts. Well, this goes on for several years. finally, the very lazy kind of bogged down apparatus of the central media they've had enough of it. So the Median army starts chasing these people around. And for a while they play, basically hide and seek. I mean, Kurush does not take on battle. He runs, he kind of goes this way, the army barely misses him. He goes that way, the army barely misses him. But everywhere the army, of the local king goes, there's discontent among the people because they all already love Kurush. So finally the king himself, and that would be his grandfather, who has no idea that Kurush is actually his grandson. Ishtuvek decides, I've had enough of this nonsense. This young upstart from nowhere is invading my land, causing a bunch of rebellion and discontent. I got to put an end to that. And so he corners Kurush for a grand standoff battle. Well, Kurush is very smart. He manages to cut off his grandfather with a small group of his own, basically royal guard, from the army, and he takes his grandfather prisoner alive. And so his grandfather is brought to the tent where his grandson is. And of course, he does not know that this kid is his grandson. The name Kurush was a name that was used in his father's dynasty. It was not a royal name that was used in the Median lineage. He's brought tied, arm and foot to the tent. Outside, his, warriors are being executed. And out comes out this young, beautiful man, with noble features, beautiful hair, warlike stance, glowing eyes. And he says, dear grandfather, I have missed you so much. I'm so glad to finally meet you. Mom sends her regards. I'm your long lost grandson. I'm so sorry that we're in this horrible situation. I'll tell you what, there are two kinds of Median kings. There's one kind of a king who resists and acts like an idiot and gets basically put on a stake and slowly dies in horrible suffering. And I would hate to do that to my own grandfather. I mean, my mom would not be able to survive that. She would cry so much. No, 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 no. There's another kind of a Median king. There's a great Median king who recognizes his glorious grandson as his long-lost heir, abdicates in the name of his grandson, and peacefully lives out the rest of his days in a very wealthy palace somewhere in the outskirts of the empire. And, Ishtuvek looks at this youngster and sees a little bit of himself in this youngster, and he says, you son of a bitch. And he abdicates. And so the rest of the progress that Kurush takes across the Median Empire towards the capital, or rather Median Kingdom, is not as much of a conquest as it is a glorious and beautiful parade where side by side are riding the grandfather and his lost long heir. He's, the grandfather's, is telling everybody, I'm so old, I'm so tired of ruling. I'm so glad my grandson found me. Behold you, new ruler, behold you, new king. Flowers of, I'm obviously giving you the Hollywood version, but and they ride into the capital, and of course, the entire time, Ishtuvek thinks that, okay, I'm kaput, I'm done for, right? Well, no. What Kurush does is, first and foremost, he takes his grandfather's palace, which was, by this point in time, the Medians have settled down. They started building and living in luxury. He has it disassembled, relocated to a province, reassembled with all his, slaves, servants, violinists, whatever the heck he has there, little singers, performers, and so on and so forth. And sends his grandfather into, honorable retirement off in the countryside, where his grandfather lives for another X amount of years and eventually dies of complete cognitive dissonance. And Kurush puts a tent in the place of where the palace used to be. And he starts ruling as the lawful, acknowledged, recognized ruler of Media. And the first thing that he says this kingdom is no longer going to be called Media. We're all Persians here. There's going to be no more of this breakup and separation between our peoples. From now on, we're going to be known as Persia. I'm going to stop and see if anybody has any thoughts, comments, questions.
Guess I would just say that that's better than a lot of Hollywood stories that I've heard. That's quite the story.
I really like Kurush. He's one of my favorite characters in the entire. That's why I love the Persians, early Persians, of course. Anyone else?
When I was going through schools and whatever, they never talked about this.
I know.
So that's why I keep coming back. I'm learning everything. with each meeting, I'm learning new stuff that we were never even taught. We were taught the party line.
Right, right. And the Persians are so misrepresented. They truly are. They all viewed from the Greek perspective, and the Greeks had very different outlook on the Persians. So moving forward, so the very first thing that, oh, by the way, just as a little side joke, and I'm totally stealing this from Lisa from Marvine's podcast, that, you know, Herodotus has this little side story about how Cyrus was raised by poor shepherds, right? Well, there was a joke that during one of Marvine's lectures that the poor shepherds that raised Cyrus must have been, you know, basically his dad's soldiers, right? Because technically they were shepherds. They just weren't quite the poor shepherds who picked up a poor boy somewhere. No, I mean, they were armed to the teeth, kind of free bandits, you know, type peoples. So in that sense, Herodotus never quite lies. Sometimes he slightly bends the truth. But anyway, so once Kurush is in the capital, he does a couple of things. First of all, he lowers the taxes. He needs to establish what's known in the Persian world as khvarna. Khvarna is basically the righteousness, the glory, the charisma. It's close to the Scandinavian concept of charisma of the king. It's that luck plus righteousness plus being beloved by the gods and being good, you know, being chosen by the people. It's the nobility that comes from within. It's that inner power and the right to rule that's based on your qualities. So he needs to establish his partner. First thing he does for the first 5 years, he institutes major reforms. First thing that he does is he takes down, because over these years, you know, the Median Zoroastrian church, it kind of grew a bunch of different complicated rituals, snobism, you know, certain kind of hierarchy. He does away with all of that. He takes it back down to the basics. All you have to do, you know, to be a practicing Zoroastrian is basically have a pure flame, you know, say the right words to the flame, just, you know, do not eat, do not kill, do not hurt, do not in any way harm your cows, and be nice to the dogs. Dogs are considered to be a very sacred animal. I don't know if I mentioned it at the last podcast, but dogs were considered to be basically living angels on earth. You don't hurt dogs. You don't, you know, again, don't shit in the river, don't piss in the flame, don't do harm to your, you know, fellow human being unless you absolutely have to. And in general, just be a good Zoroastrian, just away with all this hierarchy, away with all this snobism. Basically, he simplifies the religion right back to where it started, which of course attracts a lot of shepherds and a lot of local people to the religion, even the Semitic tribes that have been conquered and incorporated into the Median Empire, because suddenly they hear, these people are coming to us and telling us that we don't need to kill our cows. We can keep our cows, we can milk our cows, and all we have to do is to practice this religion is to sacrifice some fruits and grains and, you know, just light a fire. That religion makes a lot more sense to the general public, and so the common folk start converting much more readily. You see, but one. So yeah, so he simplifies the religious rites. But he does one weird thing. He says that the priests can no longer collect taxes from the people. That's how he eases the taxes. Well, the priesthood goes, well, everything was pretty cool up until this point. What's up with this? How we're supposed to live? And he says, don't worry about it, guys. Yeah, I'm going to put you on state budget. I'm going to finance, basically, the religion. And so that does another good thing for the religion, because now to the common folks, it looks like the priests are completely selfless, like they are doing their duties out of pure love of their God, because they're getting paid out of the state's pockets. The priest is getting paid pretty decently, so they're kind of content with that. And so everybody likes Kurush. He's pretty popular. He also has some uprisings that happen, you know, by the local Median, basically oligarchs, you know, the Median nobility that build up over time. And he does not suppress those rebellions, not at all. He tells the local common folks, look at these Median oligarchs, you know, we're trying to go back to the basics. We're trying to live a good and, you know, simple Zoroastrian life. And these rich very, basically these rich, blood-sucking leeches that have been, exploiting you this whole time. They're rebelling against me. What do you think I should do about it? And the common folks say, don't worry about it, good king. And the rebellions suppress themselves real quick like. So all is well, except he's starting to run out of money because he's paying out the priests, he's doing everything else. And so he starts looking around thinking to himself, are there any devils worshippers around here that I could possibly do righteous war on and spread further the word of, our good Zarathustra? And so he looks a little bit to the side, and there's the kingdom of Lydia. Now, Lydia is it's a kingdom that is basically they're kind of cousins, remote cousins of the Celts, and their king is a very well known in legends and in folklore is the poor and well, not poor really, rather rich. It's Croesus. That's who's ruling Lydia at that point in time. And of course, you remember the famous story where Croesus, of course, and because he is so wealthy, he must be a Devas worshiper. I mean, there's no other possible way this country could be so very wealthy. So Kurush doesn't go to war. No, he doesn't attack Lydia because he's a righteous ruler. Instead, he does things like finance rebellions on the outskirts of the Lydian kingdom. Sometimes the people who, are starting up these rebellions, they'll run out in the city square screaming, yes, we're rebelling in the name of the great King Kurush who brings, righteous ways to our country. Our evil king Croesus, he is this and that. Here and there, there's little bandit raids. He kind of pecks at the country from the sides. What he's trying to achieve is he's wanting Croesus to start the war first. He does not want to be the aggressor. That's when the famous story happens, when Croesus sends to an oracle and he asks the oracle, should I or should I not wage war against Kurush? And of course, the oracle gives the usual and very famous answer to that question. And that's no modern con artist can even come anywhere near those ancient oracles. The answer is very simple. Whoever crosses the river Granik, which is the river that separates the two kingdoms, will doom a great kingdom. That's the answer that Croesus receives. And of course, he thinks that means that if he crosses the river Granik, he's going to be victorious in this war. He crosses the river Granik, and he is just beaten and completely, basically taken prisoner alive once again. And so he is brought before Kurush. Kurush sits him down and he says, okay, Croesus, let's talk. There are two kinds of Lydian kings. They're the Lydian kings, who continue to fight and, be obstinate. And, they get beheaded or hung with something like that. And there's other kinds of Lydian kings. They're the Lydian kings who decide to rule as my representative in their own land, and they live happily ever after. And they make some changes in their country, and, let's talk, brother. Let's figure out what you want to do. And of course, Croesus agrees to become a representative of Kurush in his own kingdom. And his dynasty actually winds up ruling Lydia for several generations. And when very angry, very befuddled, Croesus sends back to the oracle after all this happened and asks, what the heck, why did you lie to me? The oracle says, we told you were going to defeat a great kingdom. Well, lo and behold, you did defeat a great kingdom. So, what happens at that point in time in Lydia? Now, of course, whether or not Lydians are devils worshippers is a big question, because Lydians are one of the earlier tribes to separate from the entire circle, so from the entire Aryan voyage, kind of from the Aryan massif of peoples. So they probably did not have quite as established separation between the warrior and the non-warrior class. Their religion was very different from everyone else. And what is the real difference between a Devas and an Ahur? And we remember that Ahur is a positive kind of deity who is benign, benevolent, and the benevolent kind of a deity would be, the Devas. Well, the difference between a Devas and an Ahur is that an Ahur will, even if an Ahur has been misled into misdeeds and doing something wrong, if it comes before the face of Ahura Mazda, of the great creator, that deity will see the wrong way, the way that's been wrong, and will change its ways and, see the true light. But if it continues to, persist, it continues to be an evildoer, then it's definitely a devas, and it's definitely a negative deity. So the Zoroastrian priests from Persia go out into Lydia, and they start talking to the local priesthood, and they say, look, priests, there are two kinds of Lydian priests. They're the Lydian priests, who stop killing their cows. We don't kill our cows. We love and milk our cows. And, other than that, continue to practice and, praise their gods the way they always have. And then there are the kind of Lydian priests who persist in the wrongfulness of their ways and bury themselves alive in the ground and slowly die of horrible deaths. What kind of Lydian priests do you want to be? Bottom line is Zoroastrianism spreads like wildfire across Lydia. And again, the common folks who only have one cow, as often is the case, scratch their heads and say, wait, we don't have to kill our cows. I think we're okay with this religion. This religion was actually it was easier to spread almost than Christianity in a way, because to come to a very poor, shepherd family and say, look, you don't need to sacrifice your cow. Nobody can sacrifice your cow. Your cow is your cow. Live as your cow. Love your cow. Take care of your cow. Milk your cow. Make cheese out of, your cow's milk. I mean, the poor people kind of like that idea. And so, that's pretty much where I want to stop for today, because Kurusha's adventures continue on. His life is really just something that, so many stories have been, I don't know, has anybody here read Terry Pratchett's The Lost Hero? That book is more or less kind of based on the life of Kurush. At least some concepts are based on the life of Kurush. He was an outstanding individual, and actually his grandson was an absolutely outstanding individual. But I want to stop here and see if anybody has any comments and thoughts or anything like that.
Well, it seems like there's a common theme in religions where you have certain religions and certain cultures that absolutely praise and worship cattle and the sanctity of the cow.
Right.
And so it's I don't know if they all have a direct thread between them, or if it's maybe a more basic understanding of this is a beautiful, wonderful resource, and this needs to be shepherded, not sacrificed.
I would agree with you, and I would even take it a step further. I would go as far as to say that I think that there's in any society there's a breakup between the religion, even within the same religion, there's that breakup between, do we want to sacrifice absolutely excessively our everything to the point where we're literally taking away from ourselves and our families and our own survival, which is something that only the wealthy can afford, or whether or not we sacrifice sparingly and in a way that is not going to impact our survival. I'm talking about the times of peace, not of course the times of calamity, disaster, and war, when everybody gets kind of desperate. And I think that there's always that tension between how much is acceptable to take from the populace, how much can one give onto the deities, to where somebody who is poor can only take away so much of their own survival capital, I guess, and somebody who's wealthy might waste that same capital that is precious to somebody who is less fortunate, that sort of thing. I don't know, it's just a thought. Does anybody else have any thoughts on this?
Kind of an echo almost, but I think that the latter part, like actually what Nathan was saying too, I think that is pretty common amongst a lot of cultures. It's kind of the waste not. And like with cows especially, even to this day, I might have said this in the last cast or one before it, but there are still people that maybe own, one, maybe two milk cows. Killing your one milk cow that you take for a walk with a leash, basically, that is just not done.
There are quite a few societies where cattle is built into the life of the society, which then becomes part of the religion. Zoroastrianism, for sure, Hinduism, possibly. East Africa, around Kenya, the Bantu and the people like that, they live with their cattle, and they're hugely important in their life. So it's not a religion necessarily, but part of the lifestyle, which combines with religion and everything.
You know, and I would say, yeah, and I would say even more, you know, when Soviet Union was being formed in the, you know, the first years of the Soviet Union, when basically when they started building these, how do I say it in English? Kolkhoz just means a collective farm. Kolkhoz was just a specific term in the Soviet Union. So when they started building these kolkhozes, which were in a way meant to simplify the life of the common village people, because, you know, families sometimes struggled, and, you know, Russian Serbs, they were at that point in time fairly backwards, and they were used to living in a communal setting and working stuff communally, but at the same time, each would have their own separate kind of household, you know, animals and stuff. When they started trying to take away the individual cows from individual families, it was a tragedy. And this was not even a religious matter. It was just a matter of, you know, I mean, there's recorded cases when, you know, women would be crying, "You're taking away our mother, you know, our mother cow. She's our feeder. She's our provider. How can you take her away from us and make her a part of a collective herd when she's a family member?" So I think there's that certain attachment to the cow as a really kind of, and I'm not sure it's even necessarily religious. It could be just purely survival / kind of an intimate bond that forms just from that codependence of human and cattle.
Well,
I was just going to say that's definitely common with horse lovers too. Horses are family. I've lived with them.
Nathan, you were going to say?
Well, and one thing with these histories that it's easy for us today, from our perspective, to lose track of is the separation between church and state. In these histories there was very little separation, and we're looking back at these histories from a viewpoint where there is a separation from church and state.
Right, and there was really no such. I mean, the church was the state, was the church in a way. And actually, you know, that's one thing in Zoroastrianism. You know, Kurush, he became the head of the church because he kind of rose up to the top because the priesthood fell right behind him, right? Because he was the righteous, the rightful heir. Technically, he reestablished the old ways. He honored all the temples. He honored all the peoples. You know, he honored all the priests and all the laws. And he was very smart, very careful to not cross any religious taboos. He was very thorough about. I mean, and considering he was a 16-year-old kid. By the way, his mother never did come back to her homeland. She stayed true to her, you know, the oath that she swore. But he was a very clever, very cunning politician. I mean, he preferred to do conquest with as little blood as possible. He preferred to either force, trick, blackmail, bribe. He always preferred to switch at least the population towards himself. And when it comes to his conquest of Babylon, we're going to talk about it because there's a reason why I talked about the discord that was happening in Babylon in the beginning of this episode, because that is going to really, really help Kurush out, because that discontent that was happening against the ruling dynasty in Babylon is going to really help with the Persian expansion a lot. And I think that's everything for today. We will continue the interesting adventures of Kurush and his descendants next time, because like I said, that's why I love the Persians. It's early Persians. Later on, much later on, they got pretty, like any old empire, it tends to get very kind of stale and very formalized. But in these early stages, they were just very glorious, very interesting to follow, their deeds and actions. Those shining, almost like shining knights. And the Persians are kind of close to us. They're those knights in the shining armor, that are sometimes stupid, sometimes very chivalrous, sometimes very glorious. They're very understandable to us, I think, in a lot of ways. Anyone else with any thoughts? Or
I love your enthusiasm.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, this was a really fun cast. Thank you.
Okay.
And all of the other historinos, as I will now call you.
Let me see what is going to be the next Thursday. So the 25th, does that work for everyone? Okay, so we will plan on reconvening on the 25th, and we'll continue with the fun story and adventures of Kurush and the Persians. Well, thank you, everyone. It's really good to see you.
Good to see you.
Thanks. Always good to see you. Have a good
Thank you.
time.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Orange glow of a campfire, pale electrical glow. Electrical glow. Both cast out shadows as our legends unfold. We are the archetypes that exist within every man's soul. Every man's soul. And we will live forever as long as stories are told. We are the archetypes that exist within every man's soul. And we will live forever, or as long as stories are told. We are the archetypes that exist within every man's soul.